Good evening, everyone. And tonight we are going to be discussing, the extra stories in Daniel. Those are the stories that we have from the Septuagint, right? The Septuagint is essentially, it's maybe a little bit of an oversimplification, but let's just for our purposes, it's a collection that was kept by the Jews of Alexandria, right, who kept many more books than the Judean community decided was worthwhile continuing to copy, put it that way. And for the Alexandrian Jewish community, for Alexandrian Jews, let's say, the books that were included were books that were considered, moral, important maybe to teach something or to tell us history. They just have to be important and to be considered not going against what you're supposed to be doing, right? So for example, Enoch does not get into the Septuagint. Jubilees does not get into the Septuagint, but Tobit does, right? Because there's nothing in Tobit that you would say, oh, hey, you can't do that, right? You bury your dead and you marry your cousin, all that is fine, right? So and it teaches you good things about, about charity, about taking care of people, about, praying. So that's a reason to keep it. And it's also it's a very fun story. So we're going to look at another fun story here, and we have it, and it was included in the book of Daniel. Even though it's not part of the original story, and it really does not seem to be part of the original story. Both of the stories we're going to be looking at tonight, I assume we're going to get to both of them. They're pretty short. Both of these stories are really not part of the book of Daniel. And we'll see that they don't even really know stuff about Daniel. Like they don't know certain things, like the way they talk about him in the original version, which is what we call the Old Greek. There's the Old Greek, and then there's the Theodotion version. The Theodotion version of these is considered to be secondary. It's considered to be the later version. Even though there are ideas that Theodotion, in certain cases, was working both off the Old Greek and some kind of Hebrew text. Because there are certain Hebraisms that we find in Theodotion, it's still considered to be the later one. That doesn't mean that these works weren't written in Hebrew and Aramaic. There is an argument about whether these works were originally in Greek or were originally in Hebrew and Aramaic. We'll discuss a little bit as we go through them. I will share my screen, and what we're going to be looking at is the English, not the English translation of the Greek, right? This is from the New English translation of the Septuagint. And you can see that it puts the Old Greek and the Theodotion next to each other so that we can compare. All right. Now, this story about Daniel and his efforts against both Bel and the dragon are put in a different context here. In the Old Greek, they are put in the context of a prophecy of Habakkuk. Habakkuk, it's supposed to be Habakkuk. Okay, so this particular this attribution to Habakkuk is considered completely secondary. We see it's not in the Theodotion version at all. All right, and what's interesting is that with the Theodotion says, okay, you've got Daniel, and we want to we're putting him in the context. In the Theodotion version, we're putting him in the context of Cyrus. And the Theodotion version does know the book of Daniel. And it says, he's kind of trying to fix the whole thing with Darius the Mede, because Darius the Mede didn't exist, but King Astyages the Mede did. Okay, King Astyages was in fact the ruler of the Medes, and he was in fact conquered by Cyrus the Persian. So this kind of fixes that. Okay, King Astyages was added to his ancestors. This is a Hebraism, right? He was collected to Nesaf, right? Like he was collected. In other words, in the Hebrew, it's probably referring to this idea that after one's body dried out, one's bones were kind of collected and put together with one's ancestors' bones, right? But this is simply translating a Hebraism. It's translating a Hebrew phrase that would have been quite common, but doesn't make much sense in Greek. And Cyrus the Persian received his kingdom. And Daniel was a companion, and the king was honored beyond all his friends. Okay. Now here in the Old Greek, he calls Daniel a priest. Now, Daniel is not a priest. There's nothing in the book of Daniel that indicates that he is a priest. So it seems like whoever's involved in whoever's doing the Old Greek or the base text, the Old Greek is based on, is talking about Daniel, but doesn't know the version of Daniel from the book of Daniel, right? Because it's calling him a priest. Okay. And there was an idol Bel, which the Babylonians would revere. Now, Bel is Baal. Baal is not the Phoenician Baal, which we normally always think of. No, it's actually a name for Marduk. And at this point in history, it's a name for Marduk, the Babylonian god. Okay, he's also called Baal. It's not surprising that he would be called owner or master. And that's another name for Marduk. Okay, so there was an idol Bel, which the Babylonians would revere. And in fact, there was a temple with a huge gold idol, temple to Marduk, that Cyrus was known as, Cyrus, at least in the Cyrus cylinder, he says that he restored the worship of Marduk, right? However, Xerxes the first is actually destroyed the temple of Marduk with its huge golden statue, right? So this is also possibly a reflection of that story, right? Because later on we'll see that this temple is going to be destroyed. And there was an idol Bel, which the Babylonians would revere. Now every day they were squandering on it 12 bushels of choice flour and 4 sheep and 6 measures of oil. And the king would revere him, and the king would go every day and would do obeisance to him. But Daniel would pray to the Lord. And the king said to Daniel, why do you not do obeisance to Bel? And Daniel said to the king, I revere no one except the Lord God who created heaven and earth. So the king said to him, is this one then not a god? Do you not see how much is spent for him every day? Right? And here in the Theodotion, it seems like, do you not see how much he eats and drinks every day? And it's like, ha, 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 you stupid king, you think the idol eats all this stuff? Now, in the actual worship of Marduk, they would in fact set out quite a table in front of him. Supposedly there was a golden table and they would put out food. The thing is, and in certain, it didn't have to be a lavish feast, but in certain cases it was a lavish feast. However, it was considered enough for the idol to kind of look at it. The idol kind of looked at the food, and by looking at the food, it ate it, right? And then the king would get the leftovers, right? So that's how they did it, you know, that's a smart way to do this sort of thing. That was the standard way they actually would worship in Babylonia. But here we have a kind of an exaggerated version of this where the king actually thinks that the idol is eating the food. Okay. So the king said to him, is this one then not a god? Do you not see how much is spent for him every day? Or do you not see how much he eats and drinks every day? And Daniel said to him, not at all. Do not let anyone mislead you, for this one is only of clay inside and bronze outside, which also tells us a little bit about how kind of the idols are constructed. Moreover, I swear to you by the Lord God of the gods that this one has never eaten anything. And angered, the king called the leaders of the temple and said to them, now what's interesting is the king right away gets angry and says, he doesn't get angry at Daniel for saying for blaspheming. He gets angry that he's been fooled, right? So the king called the leaders of the temple and said to them, produce the one who eats the things prepared for Baal. But if not, you shall die. Or Daniel, who says they are not being eaten by him. There's either you prove your point and you die, or Daniel dies rather, or you don't prove your point and you die. But they said, it is Baal himself who eats them. Then Daniel said to the king, let it be so. Unless I prove that Baal is not eating them, I shall die, and all those with me. Now there were 70 priests of Baal, not counting wives and children. 70 is, of course, like a standard number. It means like a lot, right? However, of course, it's fewer than, let's say, if you were in the priests of Baal in the whole conflict with Eliyahu, but still it's meant to be a lot, okay? So he brought the king into the idol's temple, and the food was set out in the presence of the king and Daniel, and the mixed wine was brought in and set out before Baal. And mixed wine, probably because there was a general idea that you don't drink straight wine, you always mix it with water. And Daniel said, you yourself see, O king, that these things are set down. You then seal the bolts of the shrine when it is closed. And it's a little bit clearer in Theodotion. Shut the door and seal it with your signet. The idea isn't that no one can get out. The idea is we're going to know if someone opened the door, right? Like you put like maybe a clay or something like that, you seal it with your signet, and then you know if it's broken. Now the word pleased the king. Now Daniel commanded those with him, after everyone departed from the temple, to strew the whole shrine with ashes, though no one else except him knew. And then, as he sealed the shrine, he commanded that it be sealed with the king's signet and with the signets of certain illustrious priests, and so it happened. Okay. Now it tells you already in the Theodotion, it already says that beneath the table they had made a hidden entrance, and they used to go through it regularly to consume them. So we already know how they've been eating this food, right? So he brings in ashes and he puts it there, and no one knows just it, right? In the Theodotion, the king knows. And it happened on the next year, you see, in the presence of the king alone. And it happened on the next day that they went to the place, but the priests of Baal, after entering through false doors, had eaten everything laid out for Baal and had drunk the wine. And Daniel said, men, priests, examine your seals whether they remain, and you also, O king, observe carefully lest anything be out of order to you. And they found the seal as it was, and they broke the seal. And so no one's gone into the room. So it looks bad for Daniel, right? And when they opened the doors, they saw everything that had been set out consumed, and the tables empty. And the king was thrilled and said to Daniel, Bel is great, and there is no deceit in him, right? That's he's speaking of Bel as one would speak of the true living God, right? And Daniel laughed exceedingly and said to the king, and in Theodotion, he laughs and restrains the king. He actually lays hands on the king. He like kind of says, you, right? And that's really like kind of talking down to the king. And he restrained the king so he could not enter inside, right? But he laughed exceedingly and said to the king, come, see the deceit of the priests. And Daniel said, O king, these footprints, whose are they? And the king said, of men and women and children, right? And again, in the Theodotion, it's a little clearer. And the king said, I see the footprints of men and women and children. You can see from the footprints, all sorts of different people have been going back and forth to eat the food. And he went to collect the food. And he went to the house where the priests were staying, and they found Bel's food and the wine. They actually go into the house, right? In the Theodotion, they don't bother going to the house, they know, right? And Daniel showed the king the false doors through which the priest would enter and consume what was set out for Bel. And the king brought them out of Bel's temple and handed them over to Daniel. And he gave the provision that was for him to Daniel, but he destroyed Bel. And it's a little bit clear here, and he destroyed him and his temple. Right. So again, one of the theories about where this story kind of comes from is that it's a retelling of this thing of, oh, you know, that temple of Bel and it was destroyed, right? Let me tell you the story of how it was destroyed. And that's this kind of story. Now, it belongs to and this whole, we're going to continue on. This belongs to a known kind of genre, right? Of a known genre of making fun of idol worship, right? Idol worship is ridiculous and it's worthy of being made fun of. Daniel is a wise man. He is clever. Note that there's nothing miraculous happening here. It's very different from the court stories that we have read in the book of Daniel. There's no miracle here. There's no dream. It's just Daniel being clever, right? It's Daniel being clever. He's like, I know this isn't for real. I know these idols are fake. I know there's no way this idol's eating anything. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to be clever. I'm going to spread ashes on the floor, right? And be, and detective-like, discover what's going on, right? And that's what he does. I see that Susan is asking a question. Susan, what do we think the dates, origins of the Old Greek versus Theodotion versions? Okay, so the Old Greek is considered to be compiled in this case in 100 BCE, right? And Theodotion, as far as I know, later. So the Old Greek is 100 BCE. This particular story, Bel and the Serpent, is considered 2nd century. Like I'm going to go off what Colin says here. He says, well, it's 2nd century BCE because if Old Greek is saying that Daniel's a priest, then that means that whoever's writing this story is not familiar is not familiar with the book of Daniel, or not particularly familiar. So it had to be before this was a standard part of the Bible, right? So it would have to be like, let's say mid-2nd century BCE. The person is not really familiar with the Babylonian religion, because or he's not at least writing in a context where people would know, oh yeah, but the priests don't eat the food that you set out for Marduk. It goes back to the king, right? He's not in that context. He's not in a real Babylonian context. So it would have to be in a Persian or Hellenistic context. Like, if we're dating it a little bit later than that, it would have to be Persian or Hellenistic. And you would assume, and we're going to see that the king himself seems kind of foolish, but okay, right? He's not evil. The evil people are kind of around. They kind of force the king's hand, we'll see, against Daniel. So that also implies kind of a positive relationship towards the idea of a foreign king. And that would one assume predate Antiochus, right, and his decrees and the Maccabean revolution. So we would expect it to be earlier than that. Okay, so it will be after Babylonian period, sometime in the Persian early Hellenistic period. And then there's always there's a real argument about where is this being written. Is this written originally in Hebrew? We saw some Hebraisms, at least in the Theodotion version. Is it originally being written in Greek? And that also affects the date, or less the date, more the provenance. But you would understand, if you're in Israel, then you could be making mistakes about Babylonian religion much earlier. You can be living in the Babylonian period in Israel and be making mistakes about Babylonian religion, because how would you know? You wouldn't be up close to it. So you could still, it would have to be after, obviously, the exile. But probably we're talking Persian. Probably we're talking Persian period, really early Hellenistic period. Okay, so let's dive back into our text. Here we go. So again, I'm reading mainly from the Old Greek, and sometimes I'll go to the Theodotion. Now we get to the second part. Okay, so again, Daniel, he showed the king that the priests were all lying and tricking him, and Bel is not actually eating anything. Through his clever trickery, he showed the footprints in the ashes, and the result was, of course, that the priests are killed and the temple is destroyed by Daniel. Right? He gives Daniel the kind of rule of it, and he destroys the statue and the temple as well, at least in Theodotion. And there was a dragon in that same place. Is it a dragon? Not really. It's a drakon. It's a Greek. In Greek, it sounds like it's a dragon, but in the Greek, that word is used for a serpent. It can be a magic serpent or a not magic serpent, okay? There's some kind of big serpent, right, in this place. And the Babylonians would revere it. And the king said to Daniel, surely you shall not also say about this one that he is bronze. Look, he lives and eats and drinks. Do obeisance to him, right? You can't say he's not a living God, because in fact he lives. And Daniel said, O king, give me permission and I will slay the dragon without iron or club. And the king agreed with him and said, I have given it to you. And now no one understands this, guys. I'm not going to have a good explanation for this. And taking 30 minutes of pitch and fat and hair, Daniel boiled them together, and having made a cake, he threw it into the mouth of the dragon. And after eating it, it burst open. And he showed it to the king, saying, aren't these the things you revere, O king? Right? And he's like, ha, 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 ha. I got the snake to kill itself, right? And it's showing how stupid the snake is. First of all, the snake is really greedy. It just eats this garbage stuff, right? And also, he doesn't know what's going to kill him, right? And then he blows up. Why would pitch and fat and hair make him blow up? No good explanation. And there are parallels to this. There's actually a Hebrew translated version from like the 1300s, and there's a comb. There are combs, iron combs hidden in these things, and that's what makes the serpent blow up. But it's not clear from the story. You can see that in both of them. In both versions, it's pitch and fat and hair. And it's like, I don't know. There's a theory that this story is making fun of the story of Marduk versus Tiamat. Tiamat is this kind of, a legendary kind of sea serpent thing, and Marduk fights him. And there's an idea that he's defeated by kind of the wind goes into it, and they say, and that this is kind of a misreading of the word for wind, but it's really pushing it, because Daniel's not using wind here. Like, why would this be a misreading for wind? And it's not clear why this is supposed to be so clearly something that's going to blow up a snake. But apparently we're supposed to understand that this blows up a snake. The only one who doesn't understand this is the snake. It's really stupid and greedy, right? And all those from the countries. So at this point, Daniel has destroyed Bel. He's destroyed the snake, two things that they were worshiping. And all those from the country assembled against Daniel and said, the king has just now become a Judean. He has destroyed Bel and killed the dragon. It's not really a Judean. Here it actually means a Jew. Because you say, what does that mean? He's become a Judean. Has he moved to Judea? No. What's going on is they're saying this king has now become Jewish, right? Because look what he did. He destroyed our idols, right? And you can see here, the king has become a Judean. He has destroyed Bel and killed the dragon and slaughtered the priests. And when the king saw that the crowd from the country had united against him, he called his companions and said, I am giving Daniel over for destruction. And in Theodotion, it's actually more sympathetic to the king, because it's really going into details. And when they came to the king, they said, hand Daniel over to us, and if not, we will kill you and your household. And the king saw that they were pressing him hard, and having been compelled, he handed Daniel over to them. This is something that he doesn't want to do. And in the Old Greek also, this is something he does not want to do. He must do it. Why? Because they're like, you know what? You're Jewish now. That's how bad it's gotten, that you're a Jew. And they're threatening him. Now, what does this tell us also? This is an interesting point about kind of conversion, and also for dating the book. And the truth is, if we put this before the Hasmonean period, so we only really see this idea that you kind of convert people really starts in the Hasmonean period, where in terms of as famously, right, the Hasmoneans forced the Idumeans to convert. There's no real, they have to circumcise themselves, they have to live as Jews. You are Jews now, right? And the Idumeans keep this idea up. They're now Jews, right? They're forced to it. Right. And this is the first time we have this very clear idea that you can just kind of convert masses of people, or that someone can become a Jew just like that, not through marriage. They can just become a Jew. And there's a question here. Are they saying, well, you're like a Jew, you're acting like a Jew, so you might as well be a Jew? Or are they actually saying, you know what, we think that you essentially converted, right? And that's an interesting question here. I'm going to, let's just continue and we'll finish the story. So he gives Daniel over for destruction, and where is he going to go? Of course, he is going to be fed to lions. Now there was a pit in which 7 lions would be fed, to which the conspirators of the king would be delivered. And every day 2 bodies condemned to death would be provided for them. And the crowd threw Daniel into that pit so that he might be devoured and not even have the good fortune of a burial. Right. This is actually considered, when scholars compare the Old Greek and the Theodotion, they don't think everything in the Old Greek is original and everything in Theodotion is not original. They look at it and they compare it, and they'll say, so for example, this explanation that he doesn't even have the good fortune of a burial might be additional, because it explains why they would throw him in the lion's pit, that he's not even going to get buried. Right. So, but at any rate, I kind of like the Theodotion, and then nothing was given to them so that they would devour Daniel. Like, they got used to eating 2 bodies every day and 2 sheep, and now they keep them starving. So as soon as they throw Daniel in the pit, they are going to just go to town, right? And it happened, and here we have Habakkuk being brought in again, and this is considered a secondary edition. It doesn't make a lot of sense, all right? Habakkuk, the prophet Habakkuk, is brought in, and here we have, I'm going to read the Theodotions a little bit clearer. And the prophet Habakkuk was in Judea, and he had boiled a stew and broken bread into a bowl, and was on his way to the plain to take it to the reapers. And an angel of the Lord said to Habakkuk, take the food that you have to Babylon to Daniel in the lion's den. And Habakkuk said, Lord, I have not seen Babylon, and I do not know about the pit. And the angel of the Lord took hold of the crown of his head, and carrying him by the hair of his head, set him down in Babylon above the pit in a rush of his spirit. And Habakkuk shouted, saying, Daniel, excuse me, I just think it's kind of funny. And Habakkuk shouted, saying, Daniel, Daniel, take the food that God has sent you. And Daniel said, for you have remembered me, O God, and have not forsaken those who love you. Now, I personally, if I were in a lion's pit and a prophet was flown to me, and he's like, hey, Miriam, I'm like, great, you're taking me out of the pit. And instead he said, here's dinner. I would lose it. He's like, stay in the lion's pit, but I brought you food. It's one meal for 7 days. Anyway, so that's what he flew in for. It's it's kind of Habakkuk kind of becomes Uber Eats for a second. It's a little this whole scene is for me it's kind of funny. And having risen Daniel 8, then the angel of God immediately returned Habakkuk to his place, right? And both of them, right? So Habakkuk is flown just to have this interaction with Daniel and give him a meal, right? And that's, I think the idea is to kind of connect it to the tradition of prophecy, saying, you didn't hear about Daniel before. We're telling you this happened. He had this interaction with Habakkuk. So this really happened, right? Now, after these things, the king came out mourning Daniel, right? And Theodotion is on the 7th day. And he comes out mourning Daniel. And when he stooped down into the pit, he saw him seated. Right? The king is like, Daniel's dead, and I'm really sad about it. I'm going to come out to mourn him. And there's Daniel. And when he had shouted out, the king said, the Lord God is great, and there is no other besides him. And the king brought Daniel out from the pit and threw into the pit those responsible for his ruin before Daniel, and they were devoured. So here we have in Bel and the Dragon, we actually have a series of 3 little vignettes. And they are all leading to, of course, the idea that this king is now going to recognize the greatness of God, right? So in that, it's very much like the court stories we were reading in the beginning of Daniel. However, unlike those stories, there's no miracle, there's no dream. Well, there is a miracle with the lions. With the lions, there's a miracle. What's interesting is that this story wasn't super popular. Whenever anyone talks about Daniel and the lions, they're talking about what the story that's in the book of Daniel, not this one. It doesn't echo that much, and because it's very much it's a series where it's in the first one he shows how it is all with eating. Notice how it's all kind of going around this idea of eating and devouring, where in the first one, these priests are these greedy guys who come out from under a table to eat everything that's being put in front of the idol. And of course, they end up dead. And the second one, the serpent is so greedy, it's just going to munch the thing that ends up killing it. And in the end, Daniel is not killed by the lions, right? And who ends up getting eaten by the lions? The bad guys who wanted Daniel dead. Okay, so it's a real reversal, but it's all kind of centering around this idea of devouring. It may be kind of a gluttony idea. I got idea of being kind of taken over by one's not so much desires, but by one's bodily urges. Whereas Daniel has one meal in 6 or 7 days, depending which version you're reading, and he's like, oh, thank God for this meal, right? And it's whatever Habakkuk had left over, because he just had this little bowl of soup and some bread and stuff that he crumbled in, and that's his meal, right? So that's also an idea, and also the real mocking, of course, of idol worship throughout, right? Idol worship, and the final analysis, idol worshipers, right? But of course, and everything leading to this king kind of recognizing the greatness of God. So this was and again, we can feel pretty confident in terms of because Daniel's called a priest in the beginning, that this is an independent story about Daniel, right? That this is, remember, we talked about that very early on, this idea that Daniel as kind of a folkloric hero, you probably have numerous stories kind of floating around about Daniel, right? And this is one of them. This is one that didn't make it in. And probably, first of all, it probably wasn't part of the original cycle of stories. And it doesn't, it can be for this particular one, can be fitting because it can fit in with the court stories, but it's a little bit hard to fit it in maybe to the chronology. And also it wasn't part of the original group. So that's probably another reason why it just wasn't accepted as a true or as an original Daniel story. Any questions before we move on to Susanna?
Miriam?
Yes.
Hi, we apologize. We joined late because we're sitting here in the dark. There's a general blackout in our neighborhood, in the whole neighborhood. So we're watching you in pitch blackness.
Wow.
So we joined late. We joined late, but so if I understand correctly, these writings that we're looking at today are actually older than the last chapters of Daniel that actually made it into Daniel, right?
Well, certainly older than the last chapters. Yeah, they're not. So that is a good point that you're saying, right? That they're not. They're older than the last chapters, but they're not the prophecies that typify the last chapters. So let's talk a little bit about, like, Daniel. We have the first half, which is court stories, and then the second half, which is prophecies. Right. So this absolutely predates the prophecies, or really seems to predate the prophecies. Now you could argue that, but it's the attitude, right, towards the foreign king is relatively positive, right, which you wouldn't expect once you're dealing with Antiochus's decrees. So in that way, it belongs to more the court stories, right? Where you have this idea that the main thing is, like, the point isn't to be free of the foreign king. The point is for the foreign king to recognize the greatness of God, right? And declare it. That's the point. And the point is to deal with all these idol worshipers and show them that they're wrong, right? So that's that point. But the idea, but the fact that, and then you have this fact that whoever is writing this is not familiar with Daniel 1. It does, I should say, the Theodotion does. Theodotion, the let's call him for like the author or redactor of Theodotion does seem to know more about the Daniel story, but the Old Greek doesn't, right? Again, calling Daniel a priest is just completely doesn't match all our other stuff about Daniel. So that seems to indicate that this story is kind of floating around independently and is only brought in later. Now, Susan says, do scholars think that the Avraham Terach story is inspired by this? I don't think so. I think that the Avraham Terach story, where he has this big idol smashed all the little idols, and he's like, "What are you kidding me? That big idol can't do anything." And Avraham says, "See, idols can't do anything." That's kind of typical of the whole anti-idolatry polemic that we have in Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, we have in Isaiah and Isaiah. This idea that, isn't this ridiculous? Isn't this the most ridiculous thing you've ever seen? The class, he takes a piece of wood, one piece of it he burns to cook his food, and one piece of it he turns into an idol that he's going to worship. What kind of nutty and nuttiness is that, right? And again, of course, it doesn't. There's a theology that idolaters have that allows them to worship these things, but they do have this idea that, certainly in the Mesopotamian religion, there is this idea that the idol itself does have some of the God in it, right? Kind of animating it as it works, except that it's not animate. But at the same time, like we said, the eating the food is just like seeing it. Like, it just has to see the food and then it kind of eats it, right? And then the king gets to eat whatever's left, which is everything, right? So that's that, and there's very little knowledge of that in this story, no knowledge, and an expectation, I think, that the reader is not going to have any knowledge of it either. And so it's not written in a Babylonian milieu at all. So that's another thing that seems to be true. Okay, so let's jump back in. If there are no other questions on,
One more question. One more
Yeah.
question, which I'm sure you probably answered already, but tell us again, what is the provenance of these stories? How are they preserved?
Well, they're preserved in the Septuagint. So we have them because, so we have them in more than one version. And in fact, there are different versions of this, like it comes back into Jewish tradition. There's a Hebrew translation of some of these stories in the 1300s. But they are preserved in the Septuagint. We have the Old Greek, and then we have the Theodotion. And those are two different versions, two different Greek translations of these stories, right? And they're included in the book of Daniel in the Septuagint, right? So the fact that we're extracting them from the book of Daniel to look at them separately, that is because we know that they're not part, like with, well, they're not part of the Masoretic text. No, they seem to be secondary. So we take them out, but they actually are inserted in different versions of the Septuagint in different places. Like the Theodotion version has, I don't want to misstep and say where, but they're actually, the Old Greek has them in like one place, the Theodotion has them in a different place, but they're inserted into Daniel as part of the book. Much like the prayer, remember one thing that we're not talking about today, which we talked about earlier, was the prayer of Daniel's friends. That also is inserted into the book of Daniel as, where it belongs, where they're saved, right? So we looked at that prayer when we were reading that, when we were discussing that story. So I'm not bringing it up again, but similarly, that was inserted and it was an insertion. It was a later insertion, right? So here we have things that are stories that actually had some kind of independent existence, right? And
so the earliest,
yeah.
So the earliest known versions are all in Greek.
Yes. And there's a real argument about what they were in the original. Again, the Theodotion has a lot of Hebraisms. And then we'll see that also with Susanna. There are a lot of, so there's a strong argument to be made that they were originally in Hebrew, or that Theodotion was working off of a Greek text plus a Hebrew text, right? Because there are certain things that are very common phrases in like a biblical Hebrew. Now there's another argument saying, no, he's not using Hebraisms, he's using Septuagintisms, right? Because you have these phrases in the Septuagint in Greek translated into Hebrew, and that's what he's doing. He wants it to look like the rest of the Septuagint, and so he's using these phrases. So it's an argument, right? You could say it was originally in Hebrew, could have been originally in Aramaic, could have been originally in Greek. In Susanna, we're going to see that there are puns, Greek puns, but the fact that there are Greek puns doesn't mean that they weren't created in translation when the original had like Hebrew puns or Aramaic puns that we just don't know what they were. Right. So that's the story. And yes, the earliest version we've got Greek. Yes. So, I'm sorry. One thing more for Joel, the Hebrew, if you see, and now I'm trying to remember what the name of the document is. Let me see. Just a moment. Yes, the Chronicles of Yerachmiel, right? That is that it draws a lot from Pseudo-Philo, and they were published in English in 1899, and that has Hebrew and Aramaic versions of some of these Septuagint stories, but you can actually see that it's a translation in certain cases of like the Theodotion version, right? So you can see that it's not the original. It's not an actual original Hebrew. It's a translation of the Greek. Okay, so back to our text. Let's see how far I'm really going to try and do this, even though there are a lot of references here. So let us continue to Susanna. I will open up my Susanna here. Once again, we have the Old Greek and the Theodotion, and I will share my screen. Okay. All right. So let's start from Theodotion, because Old Greek we only have from verse 5. Theodotion, and there was a man living in Babylon, and his name was Joachim. He took a wife named Susanna, daughter of Hilkiah, very beautiful and fearing the Lord. Okay. And her parents were righteous and had taught their daughter according to the law of Moses. And Joachim was very rich and had an orchard adjoining his house. And they're living in Babylon. They're living a rich life. That indicates the sort of life that, in fact, Babylon, at least some Babylonian Jews were living well into the exile, not right after the exile, but it became a fairly prosperous exilic community. And had an orchard adjoining his house. And the Judeans used to come to him because he was the most honored of them all. Right? Again, I think we're using Judeans as Jews here. Jews used to come with him because he was the most honored of them all. And that year, 2 elders from the people were appointed as judges, concerning whom the master had said, lawlessness came forth from Babylon, from elders who were judges, who were supposed to govern the people. We don't have a verse like this. We don't know where it's from. Okay. And these men were always to be found at Joachim's house, and all who had a case to be tried would come to them there. And it happened, okay? And it happened when the people left at noon that Susanna, remember the guy's wife, would enter and walk about in her husband's orchard. And every day, the 2 elders would watch her going in and walking about, and they were in lust with her, right? They lusted after her. And they diverted their own mind and turned away their eyes in order not to look to heaven. This is kind of the irony, right? You think they're going to turn away their eyes not to look at her because they're lusting after her. They should be turning away their eyes not to look at her. No, they turn their eyes away not to look towards heaven, not to think about God, nor to remember to make right decisions. And both were transfixed by her. And they did not tell one another their distress because they were ashamed to tell their lust that they wanted to be intimate with her. They know it's wrong, and so they hide it from each other. And every day they would watch eagerly to see her. These are creepers. Okay, they are just gross. Okay. And they said one to the other, now let us go home, for it is time for lunch. And they left and parted from one another. And when they bent back, they came to the same place, right? They did the creepy thing. Hey, okay, let's go for lunch. I'll see you there. Yeah, and each one circled back to kind of spy on her, right? And when they pressed one another for the reason, they acknowledged their lust. And then together, they arranged a time when they could find her alone. Because now that they both know that they're both in on it, they've got a plan. Right? And it happened while they were watching for an opportune day. She entered one time, just as yesterday and the third day. Okay, this is a Hebraism, right? Kitmo shilshom. That's what this is translating. Like yesterday and the day before that, standard phrase in Hebrew, completely incomprehensible in Greek and English, right? Kitmo shilshom, like she would do every day, right? That's what it means. Okay, so that's one example of a Hebraism. Just as yesterday and the third day, with only 2 girls and desire to bathe in the orchard, for it was hot. Now, this is important. She didn't bathe every day. They're waiting for their opportunity. It was a hot day, and she's like, you know what? I want to take a bath, right? And no one was there except the 2 elders hidden and watching her. And she thinks she's alone. Like, who's a famous bathing beauty who thinks she's alone? Bathsheba. Right, but Sheva takes a bath thinking that no one can see her and the king can see her, right? So, and she ends up in trouble, right? Similarly, in Jubilees, Reuven, when Reuven sins with Bilhah, it's because he sees her bathing. And it happened while they were watching. Okay, so she said, okay, and she said to the girls, now bring me olive oil and soaps and shut the orchard doors so that I can bathe. This is an unusual request. So now she's telling them, okay, so you got to bring them your stuff. So they leave her alone, which they normally wouldn't do. And they did as she said, and they shut the orchard doors and went out by the side doors to bring the things they had been commanded. And they did not see the elders because they were hidden. And it happened when the girls had gone out, the 2 elders got up and ran to her and said, lo, the orchard doors are shut and no one can see us, and we are in lust with you. Therefore, give your consent to us and be with us. But if not, we will testify against you that a young man was with you, and for this reason, you sent the girls away from you. Now, she is literally damned if she doesn't, damned if she doesn't, right? If she sleeps with them, that's adultery. She deserves to die. And if she doesn't sleep with them, they'll say she adultered and she'll die, okay? They have all the power here. She has none. And Susanna groaned and said, things are narrow for me on all sides. That's another Hebraism, tsarli. Right? Sarli, now things are narrowing in on me. Okay, you understand it in Hebrew, you don't really understand it in English. For if I do this, it is death for me. If I do not, I will not escape your hands. Right? It is preferable for me to fall into your hands by not doing it than to sin before the Lord. She's like, I'd rather die by a false judgment than be guilty of something I should die by God. Okay, she is really righteous and she knows what she's doing. She is gonna die, right? And Susanna cried out with a loud voice, but also the two elders shouted against her. Now, throughout this story, we do have different things that we can connect to different verses, right? And different ideas in so let me find the right thing here. Is it this one? Yes. Right. So classically, and here I'm reading from Devarim, Deuteronomy, right? Where if a man finds a woman who's betrothed, it's not even the idea. If she's a wife, she's staying at home, right? She's betrothed, she's walking around, right? Right. If he takes her and he sleeps with her, right? If he finds her in a field, you assume she was raped. If he finds her in the city, right? If he finds her in the city and no one heard about it, they kill her too because she was complicit, because she should have cried out. They should have heard her cry out, right? Here, I'm just going to do it in the English. Then you shall bring her both unto the gate of the city, and you shall stone them with stones till they die. The woman, because she cried not being in the city. In other words, she could have cried in the field, no one would have heard her. So we assume she cried out and she was raped. If she was in the city and no one heard her, they're like, why didn't she cry out? She must have been complicit. So here we have in our case, she cries out. She is not complicit. She cries out with a loud voice, help, help, okay? But also the two elders shouted against her because their whole idea is they're going to accuse her, right? And running, the one opened the orchard doors, but when those from the house heard the shouting in the orchard, they rushed in through the side door to see what had happened to her. But when the elders spoke their words, the slaves, meaning the servants really, felt very ashamed, for never had a word like this been said about Susanna, right? She was a virtuous woman. And now these two respected elders have spoken against her. They're so ashamed because clearly she's guilty, right? This is a tremendous power differential that they have. No one trusts her. Everyone trusts these two guys. And we know from the get-go, they're evil. And it happened the next day when the key people gathered to her husband Joachim, the two elders came, because everyone comes to him for judgment, etc. The two elders came full of a lawless plot against Susanna to have her put to death. And in the presence of the people, they said, send for Susanna, daughter of Hilkiah, who was the wife of Joachim. So they sent, and she came, and her parents and her children and all her relatives, all her family is there. Now Susanna was very refined and beautiful in appearance. Then the scoundrels commanded that she be uncovered, for she was veiled. That's a gloss. Here you have, and the scoundrels ordered to uncover her in order that they could be sated with lust for her beauty. What are the parallels that we know here? Let's take a look. It's unpleasant. Okay, so here, let me find the right one. Here we are. Let me see if I can find it now.
It reminds me of Isha Sotah.
Yeah, it's Isha Sotah. It's Isha Sotah. So there are a couple things here. Let's look at it this way. Okay, so there's Isha Sotah. Okay, so this is the way Theodotion has it. Theodotion says they uncovered her for she was veiled. All right. So in other words, they say they uncovered her like an Isha Sotah, a woman who was essentially adulterous, right? And her husband suspects her, right? And it says because the priest takes her, uparat Rosh Isha, he unveils her head, right? And that is what's going on. What seems to be described in the Old Greek is that they just wanted her uncovered because they wanted to look at her beauty, is closer to what Hosea and Ezekiel seem to say happens to an adulterous woman, right? She's neither not my wife, neither am I her husband. Let her put away her harlotries from her face and her adulteries from between her breasts, lest I strip her naked and set her as in the day she was born. And later on, it says it a little bit more clearer. Let me here. And now I will uncover her shame in the sight of her lovers, and none shall deliver out of my hand. The idea that this is what happens to an adulteress, she gets stripped in public. You have that in Yechezkel as well. Because your filthiness was poured out and your nakedness uncovered through thy harlotries with thy lovers. Now, honestly, both of these can be interpreted differently. Both of these things can be you were uncovered before your lovers, as opposed to you're uncovered as part of your judgment, right? And so we have in our text, we have this idea that they had her uncovered, they really uncovered her, or what they did is that she should be uncovered before she was veiled, right? They should just like uncover her head. And that makes a little bit more sense in terms of a trial because she's not guilty yet, right? How can you uncover her? She's not guilty yet. There hasn't been a trial, right? So let's actually see in terms of Jewish law. Okay, here we have, this is talking about the Isha Sotah, right? And here the adulterous woman who is suspected by her husband. And it says, and the priest grabs her hold of her clothing and pulls them. If the clothes are torn, they are torn. If the stitches come apart, they come apart. And he pulls her clothing until he reveals her heart. It means her breast. We'll see just a second why, how we know, i.e. her chest. And then i.e. her chest is not in the text until he reveals her heart. And then he unbraids her hair. Rabbi Yehuda says, if her heart was attractive, he would not reveal it. And if her hair was attractive, he would not unbraid it. In other words, if people wanted to see her breast, he would not unveil her breast. If people wanted to see her hair, he would not unveil her hair, because then there's a different reason that you're unveiling her, and this is wrong, right? So if this is something that is, if this is prurient, then no, you don't uncover her. And in contrast, of course, in this story, she's being uncovered because of prurience. They want to see her beauty. That's why they are uncovering her. Then after but those who were with her and all who saw her began weeping, right? This is a woman that everyone saw as a virtuous woman, and she's been brought so low. Then after the two elders stood up before the people, they put their hands on her head. Why are they putting their hands on her head? Let's quickly look at the parallels here. So here there are, this is the clearest parallel in terms of they're giving witness against her, right? So here we have the person who curses in the camp. Okay, I am reading now in Leviticus Vayikra, Perek Chaf Daled, chapter 24. Okay, and I'm reading Pasuk Yudaled, verse 14. You bring that person who cursed to outside the camp, and all of those who heard him curse put their hands on his head. They're bringing witness against him. They heard him curse, and they're putting their hands on his head to kind of bring witness against him. Okay, and that's what other parallels are we also supposed to think of? I do think that we're supposed to think about sacrifices, right? We're supposed to think about the idea that before sacrifice is brought, you put your hands on its head, right? And I do think we're supposed to see, I think that we're supposed to see both. They're witnesses, but she's also a sacrifice. She's a sacrifice to these evil men, okay? And she's going to be a sacrifice for the sins of the community. If they allow this to happen, they're all going to be guilty for this. So they put their hands on her head to testify against her. But she, while crying, looked up to heaven because her heart trusted in the Lord. Then the elder said, while we were walking the orchard alone, this woman came in with 2 maids and shut the orchard doors and dismissed the maids. And they're like, oh, why'd you dismiss the maids? Not because she needed to get her the bath stuff. She was doing it to plan her adultery. And a young man who was hiding came to her and laid down with her. Now, since we were in the corner of the orchard, when we saw the lawlessness, we ran to them. And although we saw them being intimate, we were not able to take hold of that man because he was stronger than we, and we had opened the doors, he ran away. In the Old Greek, it doesn't have a good explanation for him running away. But in the Theodotion, they're like, oh, he was too strong. Okay. But when we had seized this woman, we asked who the young man was, and she did not want to tell us. These things we testified. And as they were elders of the people and judges, the assembly believed them, and they condemned her to death. Then Susanna cried out with a loud voice and said, "O everlasting God, you who are familiar with secret things, you who know all things before their beginning, you understand that they have testified lies against me. And lo, I will die, though I have done nothing that they have maliciously alleged against me." And the Lord heeded her voice. And as she was being led away to be executed, God awakened the Holy Spirit of a young lad whose name was Daniel, right? And this story is put like, at least I think in the Theodotion version, it's put at the very beginning of Daniel, because it's supposed to be the prequel to Daniel. Before Daniel was Daniel, like he's young. The Holy Spirit of a young lad whose name was Daniel, and he shouted with a loud voice, I am innocent of this woman's blood. Then all the people turned to him and said, what is this word that you have spoken? So he, as he stood among them, said, are you such fools, O sons of Israel, without examining nor learning the plain truth? Do you condemn a daughter of Israel? They didn't examine the witnesses. So again, let's just quickly look at some parallels here. Okay, so here we have, I want to make sure I'm finding the right Mishnah here. Here we are. Okay, so first I wanted to say here, when someone is tried, and this I'm reading from the Mishnah Sanhedrin, Sanhedrin Vav, chapter 6, right? It says, if one of the judges says, I can teach a reason to acquit him, the other waves the cloth as a signal to the man on the horse. There's already been a trial. It's already happened. And he says, no, I can acquit him. And he stops them, right? And they wait until the court determines, right? And even this, the bold isn't the actual words of the Mishnah. I'm reading the translation, but it's the bold is actually in the words. And even if he, the condemned man himself, says, I can teach a reason to acquit myself, he is returned to the courthouse, even 4 or 5 times, provided there is substance to his word. In other words, at any time someone's like, wait, he was condemned, but I have evidence that he's okay, or I have a reason to say that he's okay, you go take him back to the courthouse. That's kind of what we're seeing here, where Daniel's saying, I have, wait, you're taking her to be executed, stop, I have evidence. And then of course, the idea of you did not examine them enough. Of course, we have the Mishnah in Avot, which is a little bit less, you wouldn't use it as a legal source, but in the first chapter of Mishnah Avot, right, Shimon ben Shetach used to say, be thorough in the interrogation of witnesses and be careful with your words, lest they learn from them to lie. In other words, you need to interrogate witnesses. And that's clear, but this, honestly, it's common sense, right? What Daniel is saying is common sense. He doesn't have to rely on the law here. You should be examining witnesses. And here we have in Mishnah of Sanhedrin, and this is a legal statement, right? In Sanhedrin chapter 5, parak Hey, right? Whoever increases interrogations, it's praiseworthy, right? You need to question them, you need to interrogate them and make sure that they know what they're talking about and that they're not liars. Okay, let's go back to our text. Okay, and he's like, you're not examining them at all. Are you such fools, O sons of Israel, without examining nor learning the plain truth? Do you condemn a daughter of Israel? Return to the court, for these men have testified lies against you. Remember, you return to the court. You don't just let it go. And all the people returned quickly. And the elder said to him, come, sit among us and tell us, for God has given you the right of an elder. And Daniel said to them, separate them from far from one another, and I will examine them. So when they separate one, now again, we see Daniel's cleverness. This isn't some kind of, now on the one hand, God made sure that Daniel showed up, right? And on the other hand, Daniel's showing his cleverness here, all right?
And Miriam?
Yes.
I think the verse daughter of Israel is very strong proof of what you said before, that the original is Hebrew, because Bat Israel is very much Hebrew. I don't know how it's in Greek or Aramaic.
Yeah. I mean, it's true that Bat Yisrael, I mean, it is absolutely a very strong statement in Hebrew. At the same time, it's understandable in Greek. Like you can understand why someone would say that in Greek, as opposed to like the Tmol Shilshom, yesterday and the day, which makes no sense when you're reading it in non-idiomatic Hebrew, right? So it's more forceful in Hebrew and has more echoes, right? Of the idea that you just can't take advantage of a daughter of Israel this way. Return or assume that she's guilty of this sort of thing. Return and all the people return quickly, and he is going to separate them and he's going to examine them. So when they were separated one from the other, again, one from the one, also like he summoned one of them and said to him, You that have grown aged in wicked days, your sins have now come, which you have committed formerly, when you judged unjust cases and condemning the innocent while releasing those responsible. The Lord said, you shall not kill an innocent and righteous people. Now, therefore, now therefore, if you really saw this woman, tell, under what tree did you see them having intercourse together? Then he said, under a mastic. Then Daniel said, truly you have lied to the detriment of your own head, for already as the angel of God receives a sentence from God, he will split you in two. This is a pun in Greek. Okay, the word for mastic is close to the word from to split, to cut. So this is a pun, right? And that's one of the arguments for this is originally in Greek. However, for a long time, people said that doesn't really prove anything. It could either have been a pun that was created in Greek just because it was created in Greek, or it could be that there was some other kind of pun in Hebrew or Aramaic, and so a different pun was created in Greek. Lots of tree names you could use. By the way, the translation into Hebrew that I was talking about before, it doesn't have the pun because it's translating from the Greek back into Hebrew, and it just takes the trees and there's no pun to it because it's a translation of the Greek into Hebrew.
As far as we know, as far as I know anyway, a mastic is a latamastic, which is not a tree, it's a bush. A person can't fit underneath that thing.
But the whole point is the pun. Yeah, but the whole point is the pun. Like, it's a pun, right? And that's what it's for. And what's interesting is, and one of the arguments against the puns being original to the story is that they don't get chopped, right? Because both of them have them being like chopped down, and that's not how they die. So maybe, so it sounds like maybe these puns are not the original ones. And after he had him removed, he ordered them to bring the other, and he said to him, "O seed of Canaan and not Yehuda, beauty has beguiled you and lust has twisted your heart. Thus you used to treat the daughters of Israel, and they, being afraid, would have intercourse with you. But a daughter of Yehuda did not tolerate your lawlessness." Everyone's like, wait, what? Yisrael is like, what's going on here? There's some think that this is actually a dig at the Samaritans. That this is because they're in the northern kingdom of Israel, quote unquote, and the Samaritans are not quite as pure. But the fact is, these guys are bad no matter what. In other words, they put them in a situation where they don't know what to do. But the daughters of Israel have succumbed, and the daughter of Yehuda has not. Okay. Now, therefore, tell me, under what tree did you catch them having intercourse together? Then he said, under an evergreen oak. Then Daniel said to him, truly, you also have lied to the detriment of your own head. For the angel of God is waiting with a sword to saw you in two, so as to destroy you. Again, it's the word for to saw you, to saw, and the word for oak, the evergreen oak, are similar words in Greek, not exactly the same, but it's a pun. And the whole assembly shouted with a loud voice and blessed the God who saves those who hope in him. And they rose up against the two elders because Daniel had implicated them out of their own mouth that as false witnesses, and they did to them what they had wickedly intended to the neighbor by doing to them according to the law of Moses, and they killed them. And guiltless blood was saved that day. Now in the Old Greek, they silenced them and took them away and threw them into a ravine. So they throw them into a ravine, but all the puns were about being chopped up. So that's possibly, maybe the original Aramaic puns had to do with throwing them into something or whatever. They silenced them. The word actually means muzzled them. There's it could be that it's from zamam, and that zamam, you mean like they, as they did, they meant to falsely testify, zamam, and so they were muzzled, zamam, like in other words, it's that's why it's saying they were silenced, right? And that points to an original Hebrew. So anyway, they killed them. Guiltless blood was saved that day. Then Hilkiah and his wife expressed praise concerning their daughter together with her husband Joachim and all the relatives, because no shameful deed was found against her. And Daniel became great in the presence of people from that day onward. The Old Greek doesn't care about her so much. It says how for this reason youths are beloved by Yaakov because of their simplicity. The end of Theodotion is look how great. Look, no shameful deed was found against Judith. The end of the Old Greek is look how great young people are. Look how great young people are. This is why we need young people, because the young people are like, you dirty old man. I know you're up to something, right? That's why young people are great. And and they're particularly beloved. We as a people love Jews. We as Jews love young people. For youths will be pious, and the spirit of knowledge and understanding shall be with them forever and ever. And so here we have a situation of a story with a lot of drama, where it's, I think particularly in modern times, this is particularly painful, because we have, unfortunately, these stories of women who find themselves in situations where I am not going to be believed, and these men are going to be believed, and what do I do? What do I do? And here we have a situation of that. It is, it's a story where, with a recognition of corruption and that you cannot trust people in power, right? And that's why you should listen to young people, right? But also it's a story, and why is it Daniel? Simply because Daniel's a judge, right? Daniel, his name means to judge. He's a figure with, with a reputation. And so he is the person who saves them. By the way, there are numerous different versions of the story. The Samaritans have a version of the story where she's the daughter of Amram, the high priest, right? And he is the one who kind of saves her. So they're all, there are different versions of the story, not with Daniel. This one is with Daniel. And so it's included in this book. And that's why we have it. That's why you have it, at least in this version. So kind of lucky for us. So you saw that it draws from a lot of kind of a legal of common legal practice. And it kind of opens this idea of, can you trust what the elders are saying? Not always. And you have to be really, really careful, because there are people who are weak in this world and people without the power. And you have to kind of pay attention to when people are using their power to take advantage of others. So I think that's why, yes.
Do all the versions of this story take place in Bavel?
Well, the Samaritan version is, a priest of Har Grizim. He's a high priest of Har Grizim, and it happens to his daughter, right? So that would not be in Bavel, right? So, but obviously the Old Greek and Theodotian, both the Old Greek were missing the beginning, right? So it is interesting that it's happening specifically in Babel and Babylonia, and I think that's also another reason to have Daniel come in, because Daniel is in Babylonia, right? He's taken to Babylonia, so it makes sense for him to be kind of the guy who's the savior.
But the husband of Susanna, Jehoiakim, there's no connection between him and the evil Jehoiakim Melech Yehuda from the days of Yirmiyahu.
Well, there are actually some scholars who want to connect him actually more to Joachim, right? Who goes out who goes out in exile. So there's some who want to connect him to that. It's not explicitly, that connection is not explicitly made, and Joachim is not. I mean, I don't know if Joachim or Joachim. I don't think she's supposed to be the daughter of a king, because it doesn't say that. Hilkiah is a very common priest name, actually, and you would understand why, because it's the portion of God, right? Hilkiah, the portion of God. My portion is God, rather. My portion is God. So you would understand why that would be a good priest name, and that's her husband. So, but it doesn't say explicitly that her husband's a priest, right? So it kind of leaves things to you. I think it just wants to have biblical names. I think that's the idea. Have resonating biblical names.
The reason I'm asking, although the chronology really doesn't match up, is
sorry, Hilkiah is her father, not her husband, of course. Excuse me. Go ahead.
The chronology really doesn't match. It probably predates the whole thing, but there's sort of seems to be something of a parallel here between the righteous wife of an evil man. The whole story.
You mean Abigail and Naval?
No, I was thinking of something much later. I was thinking of Shlom Tzion, the wife of Alexander Yanai, but that's much later, isn't it? But
there's nothing to indicate here. On the contrary, her husband is important. Her husband is respected. The people come to her husband her husband's a wise man who's widely respected, very wealthy and widely respected. Everyone's coming to his house, right? So this is not that. This is not that. Her husband is not evil. Her husband doesn't have much of a speaking role here, right? He's not like, what? How could you say? But he's also not accusing her. He's not the one who's like, she must die. He doesn't come, he's not like, oh, he's just kind of not. And I think probably because if he did have a speaking role, it would make the story way more complex than the author of the story wants it to be, right? He wants it to be pretty clear cut. If you have a husband who's feeling betrayed, that brings in it's a whole different drama that we don't have time for. So I think that's why we don't hear much from her husband.
Actually, there's another parallel.
Yeah.
There's another parallel I was thinking of is that Yosef and Eshet Potiphar. Did you mention that?
Yes. So you're right. Thank you. There is absolutely a parallel between Yosef and Eshet Potiphar, especially this thing that he's like, look, I'm not going to sin with you because I fear God, right? That's what's most important to me. And that's what she does as well, right? She's like, what's most important to me is God and what God commands me. And so I'm not going to sin with you. Absolutely. Yes. Right. And then being falsely accused right? By someone with more power in the situation. It is true that this idea that everyone's crying that she's been accused this way shows that she had a tremendous reputation beforehand, and everyone is feeling this grief over her lost reputation, over how low she's been brought, right? And she doesn't have much control. Realize how little control she has over any of this, right? No one is listening to her at all, right? She's completely, so she cried out in the beginning, and after that, the only thing she does is she prays to God, right? She has zero control over what's being done to her reputation, and everyone is crying. It's gone. It's gone. Her reputation is gone. And on that note, thank you everyone for coming. And I will see you next week for our final retrospective.